Welcome back. This is part 2 of the cast drawing video. I'm going to begin by creating a piece of transfer paper. I'm just rubbing graphite powder onto a spare piece of tracing paper. You can buy transfer paper, or you can just rub graphite from a pencil onto the back of your actual drawing. But I'm just creating a little transfer paper to work with. So I'm going to put the extra graphite back in the jar. And that face down under there. I'm going to test my transfer paper to make sure it works the way I want it to. And you can see that's the right there is what I drew. That's fine. So now I'm going to put that between my gray charcoal paper and my traced drawing, and I'm just going to go over the main outlines and the shadow mapping. And at this stage I'm not worried about making my drawing better. In other words, I'm not paying too much attention to the photograph. This is purely for the purpose of transferring the work that I did in the first stage onto my nice paper. In the past, drawings were normally used as preparatory for more finished works of art. And so you'd rarely see this transfer of a drawing onto a nicer piece of paper. The exception would be in what was called a presentation drawing. In other words, a drawing that was intended to be viewed as a finished work of art. And that's what you'd call what we're doing today. So I just lifted up my paper to check to make sure it was transferring all right, and noticing that my transfer paper was a little short, so I'm shifting it around to make sure I always have some good graphite underneath whatever section of the drawing I'm working on. And I think that's everything. A little more right here. Notice the paper is just hinged, taped on one side, so that I can lift it up without losing my alignment, and I can keep checking for any details I might have overlooked. And that looks pretty good. So the idea with a preparatory stage like this is that we've done all our fudging and erasing and everything on this piece of paper, which we are now going to just throw away. We're done with that. And we're going to start our shading very neatly and carefully on this new piece of paper. And the goal is to make it seem as if this is where we were beginning. And it's going to make us look really, really skilled, more skilled than we are. Which was always the goal. Most traditional art techniques, the goal is usually to make yourself look more skilled than you are, and like what you did was much easier than it actually happened to have been. So I'm left-handed, and so my first shading is exclusively this direction. If you are right-handed, I recommend shading the other way so that you're using some of the big muscles in your arm to shade and not just the small muscles of your fingers and forearm. And you can see I've already done the hard part. I already know where my shadow edges are, and I can just lay in these forms of dark again without I'm not thinking too hard about what I'm doing. I'm just doing it. Eventually I'm going to want to get a piece of tracing paper under my hand, because at this stage of the drawing I don't really want to be smudging anymore. I prefer a very clean, pristine kind of look for these presentation drawings. And a lot of the goal is just making it look easy, even when it wasn't. You saw me struggle with some of these proportions in the first video, but now it just looks like, you already can't see much of the transfer, and it just looks like I just went for it pretty effortlessly. I don't let myself do any detail shading until I've completed this step. First shading everywhere, because it's very important to start to create an illusion of solidity in the drawing before you go in and start pulling out details, because as soon as your brain starts to catch sight of those details, your brain, I believe, has a much harder time perceiving the big relationships. And if the details are not related to each other correctly, it doesn't matter how convincing they are, the drawing is not going to be successful. So I'm going to really overlook for now the fact that this background is much darker than the cast, and I'm going to just very lightly put a little bit of tone here to bring out this edge. But this is all, in spite of the dark local color, this is all in light, so I'm not gonna do much with that. I'm using a much lighter hand right now than I was for my shadows. Okay. So now it's time to start thinking about these forms one by one. So we're going to zoom in a little on this eye socket. And what I'm seeing first of all is a little core shadow right along this edge. And notice I'm hatching across the edge because even though that edge is fairly sharp, it's nowhere near as sharp as, say, the edge of a cube. So I don't want to draw it too dark. Then I have another dark on the upper surface of the eyelid here. And a little crease at the top margin of the lid. And a strong reflected light inside that shadow, which I'm going to just leave color of the paper. And I'm going to very lightly do a slight core shadow along the lash line. A slight darkening of the white of the eye under the lid. And a slight darkening right here. This upper lid is casting the shadow onto the lower lid. And then this shadow edge goes over the ledge there of the lower lid, and then turns into a fairly sharp cast shadow. Notice that this whole cast shadow of inside the eye socket is a step darker than this reflected light above the eyelid. And then it gets darker as it comes in towards the center of the eye socket. And while I'm working this little area, I'm going to bring out some darks in the hair. Again, I'm thinking through the cast shadow like this one and a form shadow like the one above it. Usually a core shadow along the upper margin of my form shadows. Here's a big form shadow with a little accent along there and a little deepening of the shadow near the bottom of that curl where it intersects the ear, like that. And while we're focused on this area, I want to clean up my lights and then go in with white. Usually I'm going to wait and do all my lights at the end, but I'm trying to make this demonstration as quick as possible, so I'm going to just knock them in as I go. We have to be very disciplined never to touch reflected lights like this one with the white pencil. And the advantage here of this fresh piece of paper should be pretty clear. It's really that if I was working on that smudged up piece of tracing paper with my whites, they would all be gray by now. But this nice pristine paper is taking the light very nicely. Okay, I'm going to switch my focus down to the nose. Here's the tip of the nose with a little darkening of the cast shadow underneath it, and the form shadow of the tip of the nose, and then the core shadow, which I'm again shading perpendicular to the shadow edge in order to create that roundness. And along the bridge of the nose, I'm going to shade also across that edge. And drawing at this stage is really just accounting for form. You look at your reference, and you read the forms, and then you try to recreate those forms in your drawing and make them at least as legible, if not more legible, than they are in the photograph. So it's hard to read the forms inside the shadow here, but there's a little darkening along the top of that nostril and a little darkening underneath it. There's a little lightening all the way across the bottom margin of the nose from reflected light, and a little darkening along the whole side of the nose, which is getting little or no reflected light. I'm not sure all my placements are perfect, but they're going to have to be good enough. Those are all decisions I made in the other video, and I'm going to have to live with them. It would also be a lot easier for me to see in real life some of the variation within these light areas, which are completely kind of blown out in this photograph. But it's easier for me to demonstrate the technique from a photograph, so that's what I've done. So let's work our way down to the mouth. Use a little more light along the tip of the nose. And we've got Cupid's bow shape very foreshortened on this side, this large formed shadow, and less foreshortened and more elongated along this side. And very distinct reflected light illuminating the underside of that upper lip. And a darker cast shadow on the bottom lip, which is receiving no reflected light. And then another reflected light on the bottom plane of the bottom lip right there, and another cast shadow kind of darkening along the top of the chin. And another darkening way down here of the neck where the head is casting its shadow onto the neck. Zoom out just a little. And I'm going to make one change. Just going to slide this light over slightly to the right just to reduce what looked to me like a little too much slope of the nose. Okay, now onto this eye. I'm going to note that the upper lid is a little darker, again because it faces the ceiling. It's not getting any reflected light. The white of the eye is the eyeball itself is kind of a mid-tone. This little shelf of the bottom lid is darker, again facing the ceiling. And then the cheekbone is a little darker because again it's facing up. And the key there is it's sort of an upside down world. On the light side of the head, the things that face up are getting more light. They're facing the light source. And on the shadow side, the things that face up get less light because the only light source, the only light that's reaching into those shadows is reflected from the ground plane. And that's hard for beginners to wrap their heads around because you're used to just shading darker as you go down, but as you could just see a second ago, the goal here was for me to shade darker instead as I went up. And that pattern is going to continue in the hair where we have these tops of these rows of curls are darker and they're lighter underneath. So, oops, I just put that one way too high up. That one goes there. And if I have to change something, I'm just going to erase and then put my first shading back in. So the second curl is up here a little bit above the level of the eyebrow. third is up here. And here's where it gets interesting. We've got a darkening along this edge of the core shadow, and notice it's an irregular shape because the light is not hitting a smooth cylinder, it's hitting this irregular form of the braid, and that's where this texture of these movements left and right, that's going to be the key place where the texture of the entire hairdo, we can call it that, is sort of comes out. So I'm putting a little extra focus on that zone. Again, it's darker along the top of this curl underneath. And so we have a feeling of the reflected light bouncing up and underneath that curl. And the last shadow shapes on the head are these little islands of shadow. And even these get a little darker along the margin where they're touching the light, and a little darker again in the valley, so that you have a sense of that reflected light filling each one of those little shadow shapes, like that. I'm going to just do a little bit of detail I just noticed in the ear. And now we're going to take a virtual step back from our work and compare. And you can see that mostly what's left to do is distributing the rest of those lights. I'm going to have to do a little bit of invention here because I can't read the changes, as I was saying, inside these light forms. But I still know more or less what the forms are doing, so I know where the light's coming from, and I can lay a little brighter highlights along some of the outsides of those curves. I know the hairline is ending about here. And I know that the forehead is facing the light up here and turning away from the light off here to the left. There's usually a heightening of the light right here along the muzzle form, heightening right here underneath the little pocket at the outside of the lip. less light in this halftone underneath the cheekbone, and a little more light again under the chin. This light kind of merges into with the light that's on the lip. Light along the side of the neck here, which I just made a little fat. I'm going to pull that back. I'm trying to avoid editing as I go, but sometimes I'm going to see things that I can't quite live with. And I'm going to get into some of the detail on the pedestal base. In case you're wondering about the weird texture right here between the eyebrows, these are 3D prints of a cast that I made here at school, and I tried to fill in those striations with acrylic modeling paste, but I didn't get all of them, so I might do a little more work on this one and put on another coat of gesso. So the direction that this shadow is falling is telling us a lot about the form of the neck. I just noticed this crease right here, which again, this part faces up, so it's going to be darker. And then when we go over this boundary, the up-facing part gets lighter. You can see that. So that's a great example of the difference in those two worlds. The world that receives direct light is generally lighter with up-facing planes, and the shadow side is lighter on down-facing planes. There's a little up-facing plane right there. This cast shadow that falls down onto the sort of donut form of the base itself. And here's a pretty major edit from my original drawing. I was pretty careless about the bottom of this edge. Here I'm trying to curve my shading around that form, bring a highlight here. So now I'm taking a look at the overall effect, and I'm feeling like my reflected light under the nose is getting a little lost. Part of that is because it's maybe not light enough, but part of it is that I need to darken all around it. This plane is quite a bit darker. More importantly, this whole side of the face needs to be brought down. And this is really a matter of sort of unifying the shadows. I don't want it to look quite so patchy. So when I want to pull things together, I just go back to my first shading direction and just sort of shade over that whole zone. And I'm going to gradually lighten as I move down into the down-facing region. And this is really a stage of the drawing where I'm, again, looking at it globally. I'm looking at the overall effects that I've achieved. And if this was a more sustained study, I'd be switching back and forth quite a lot between looking at it piece by piece and looking at the big effects. Right here I feel like there's a little bit of unclarity, if that's a word. This could be a little clearer, this little transition. This core shadow at the bottom margin of the lower lip kind of wraps around a little more and connects to the cast shadow under the bottom lip. This shadow shape is a little darker right here with the up plane, and it darkens again here as it's turning towards the light. This upper lip gets darker along its upper margin, turning towards the light. And that's a little more of a satisfying effect. This core shadow could be a little darker. And this little triangle of cast shadow could definitely be darker. That's a zone that's receiving not too much reflected light. Now we'll zoom back out. And I notice I'm missing a little bit of this definition of this eye socket plane. That upper lid margin. And now I'm just unifying a little more. I'm suppressing any patches of light that I don't understand. When I see a little lightning within that big shadow, I'm asking myself, why am I seeing that? And typically, if I can't explain it to myself, and I look closely at my reference, I'm going to notice that it actually is not. It's not actually there. noticing this transition's a little too sharp. It's kind of thrown a little by that texture I was talking about, but it should be a little more gradual here and here. And that's going to about do it for us. This is pretty basic cast drawing. Nothing. When you look at an atelier cast drawing, you're looking at something that's usually achieved over a period of between 6 and 100 hours. This is basically about half an hour to map it out and another 40 minutes or so to create the finished study. But this technique is a little more suited, a little better suited to a high school classroom where we do not have days and days to work on a single cast drawing.